Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. I know it's been a while. I took a bit of a break, a bit of a longer break this time, simply because a lot of things were piling up on me, but I'm glad to be back and to be back with another episode of my recurring series, The Critical Corner. Now, this is actually episode 11 of this series, and if you are new to this channel, first of all, welcome, but secondly, The Critical Corner is a series on my channel where I do reviews in shorter form of either all music or all movies. Today's episode is going to be focused on all movies since my last couple of videos have been very heavily music focused, and there have been a lot of movies I've been watching over the past couple months. So, let's go ahead and get started with our first movie.
Cue the creepy dude in the mask.
Like I said.
Okay, so this first movie I'm talking about, Freaky, is the first movie I've gone to see in theaters in a while, and honestly, with this movie, my interest was very mild at best. The concept sounded sorta interesting, and this director, Christopher Landon, he does concepts like this where he takes something that's really familiar and then puts a horror spin on it. As you all know with the Happy Death Day movies, if you've seen them, he takes the Groundhog Day premise and basically makes it horror version where this person is waking up every day in the same day and going through the same sequence of events, and at the end of every day she has someone killing her and she's trying to figure out who that person is. Freaky does something similar where it takes a very familiar concept and gives it a horror spin. This time they're doing that with the Freaky Friday concept, as the movie's title would imply. So essentially, main character Millie, who is a character who is very unconfident in herself and feels like she isn't appreciated in school, and she's always very nervous and very unconfident, she essentially starts getting stalked by this serial killer named the Butcher, who is played by Vince Vaughn, and one fateful night the serial killer catches her and he kills her with this mysterious knife. Well, kills her with a mysterious knife, but the knife seems to have a different effect to where both the Butcher and Millie switch bodies the next day, and basically it's up to Millie, now in the Butcher's body, to try and switch their bodies back as well as catch the serial killer in the act, trying to deceive people while he's in Millie's body. Now obviously this plot is something we have definitely seen before, and it is pretty predictable, but I'm not gonna lie, I did have a lot of fun with this movie. If you're going in expecting a very intellectual, super scary horror movie, then you're not really going to get that. In fact, I would say this movie did a pretty good job of showing what it was going to be like based on the trailers. This movie is very much so a horror comedy, and that's actually probably the strongest aspect to me, is the horror comedy hybrid. I think this movie does that pretty well, and it even has a pretty fun time with it. Also, performance-wise, this movie is pretty solid. Kathryn Newton is really good as Millie. I've really started to grow on this actress a lot. The more I've seen her in, the more she has just continued to improve in her craft. I think she's just really good at giving across these convincing performances and always singing herself into whatever type of character she plays. And she does good at transforming from the unsure, unconfident Millie to this vengeful, sadistic serial killer character. And she really has a lot of fun with the role, although I wish the director had given her more to do because the serial killer is mainly silent in this movie. No, the real highlight here is Vince Vaughn as the Butcher slash when he becomes Millie. When he becomes Millie, man, his performance is just so good and just so much fun. He is really embracing playing this character, and I just appreciate how much he dedicates himself to it. If you don't go to this movie for anything else, go to it for Vince Vaughn's performance. Now, there are definitely some problems with this movie. Like I was implying earlier, this movie is very predictable. You're going to see the beats of what's going to happen. You're going to see where the movie is going to go once you go in, and you sort of understand what the problem with Millie is going to be. It's a problem that's done with a lot of high school comedy movies where the main character is very unconfident and very insecure in herself, but then by the end of the movie, something has happened to her which has made her a much more confident person. And also, I do think some of the other performances outside of Vaughn and Newton aren't super interesting. The woman who plays the mom and the woman who plays Millie's sister just aren't that interesting. Thankfully, they aren't in the movie that much, but anytime they're around, the movie becomes a lot less interesting. And I feel like Millie's friends, even though it's clear they're having fun with their performances, They are sort of stereotypes. However, overall, Freaky is actually a pretty fun movie. I went in with relatively low expectations. The trailer looked sort of silly, but I appreciate that the movie itself does embrace silliness, and there's even some pretty creative kills in here that bring the movie up. And of course, Vince Vaughn's wonderful performance is enough to make me really enjoy this movie, and it's even a fun enough movie that I might return to it a couple more times. So I'm going to give this a solid 3.5 out of 5 stars. I think that's a fair enough rating for this. Give it a watch if you want. I think it can appeal to a variety of horror fans, and I think you'll have a fun time with it.
People say, you know, Abby, are you concerned about an overreaction from the cops? Holy shit.
Next up is The Trial of the Chicago 7, which was directed and written by Aaron Sorkin, who is a pretty well-known writer, more than he is a director, but he did take directing helms for this movie. And it is pretty much about what it sounds like. It is about a group of 7 people who are put on trial for sort of starting a revolt / an uprising at the Democratic National Convention, and the trial is basically people trying to prove them guilty, specifically the FBI, of crimes of inciting violence and inciting riots, while these people on the other side are saying that the riots were started essentially by the police, and they were there protesting peacefully, and they should have had a right to protest. Now, I'll admit, my opinions on this movie are probably a little more mixed than other people's. I'll start with what I really liked first. I think what definitely did raise this movie up were the performances. I think all around, the performances from the central cast were really good. Sacha Baron Cohen was having a great time in the main role. He was a pretty fun character to follow, and I liked how the movie started revealing more and more layers about this character, who essentially seems like just a sort of silly, absent-minded comedian at the beginning of the movie, but by the end you saw him as someone much more deeper and who knew a lot more. Eddie Redmayne was also good as the sort of character who goes through, I would debate, most changes in the movie, but probably the best performance in the movie was Yahya Abdul-Mateen II. He was just so powerful in this movie and really let his acting shine. He was so compelling, and it was heartbreaking to watch what he had to go through. And the commentary surrounding him about racism and about how the judicial system and all other American systems were basically bringing him down was really powerful and really quite interesting to watch. My biggest problem with this was not his performance, though. My biggest problem with his character was that writer/director Aaron Sorkin really sort of pushed him aside for the second half of the movie. I really felt like this conversation in the movie was the most important to have, and the movie just sort of leaves him out for the rest of the time. Another big problem with the movie for me was that, unfortunately, the trial scenes, which take up the majority of the movie, were not that compelling. I actually liked the scenes outside of the courtroom where they were showing things happening, like the characters going out and protesting, or the characters holding a concert. Things like that were a lot more interesting and held a whole lot more kinetic energy to me, whereas these trial scenes were really dull and felt really downplayed a lot of the time. Another big problem actually did, unfortunately, come from Aaron Sorkin's writing, believe it or not. For the most part, I did enjoy his writing in this movie. There's some lines in here that are pretty good, but there's also some lines in here that I just don't think would come from any living human. Just some of them sound like they're witty for the purpose of being witty, like they're saying something in a punchline in a way that just, I feel like the character in real life probably wouldn't say, except for maybe Sacha Baron Cohen's character, who's just sort of like that. And also, I have to say, the ending of this movie, I'm not going to spoil it, but the ending of this movie is really cheesy. It feels sort of forced, and it brings in a conversation that wasn't even really in the movie up until this point. It felt very shoehorned in and just very over the top. And they just have this ending where everyone sort of comes together. It's just this weird moment of unity that felt very half-hearted to me, that just didn't work, and it felt like this sort of tone-deaf ending, in my opinion. So overall, I'm cut very down the middle about this movie. There's some really good aspects of it, but there's also some aspects that I just don't care for. So I'm going to give it a light 3 out of 5 stars.
You do everything for me. You teach me.
Next up is the movie Run, directed by Anish Chaganty, starring Sarah Paulson and Kiera Allen. And this movie is about a mother-daughter relationship where the daughter, Chloe, has a lot of medical problems that she's had since childbirth, like rashes, diabetes, she's confined to a wheelchair, her skin is very sensitive, her bones are very sensitive, things like that. And because of that, her mother is very protective of her, which is sort of understandable with all these issues that she has. But we do get the impression, in the start of the movie at least, that the mother and the daughter have a pretty trusting relationship with one another, and they both really care about one another. However, Chloe starts becoming very suspicious when her mother gives her a new set of medication which she's never had before, and she sort of discovers that the medication belonged originally to her mother, but her mother covered up her own name with her daughter's name. And so Chloe sets out to find stuff about her mother and becomes very suspicious of her, and as time goes on, she starts to unravel some very dark secrets about her. Now, the director of this movie actually made a movie called Searching a couple years back that I really enjoyed. I found that movie to be very innovative in how it took the sort of computer genre, using simply computer footage and only using that to tell its story, and he did a really good job with that and in creating a compelling mystery. This movie is not quite as good as Searching, not quite as innovative, but it still really works. This movie seems at first to be a pretty simple, straightforward thriller, but I feel like as the movie goes on, it becomes a lot more interesting, especially in how it portrays the daughter, Chloe. Now, something I appreciated about this movie was that the director actually hired an actress named Kiera Allen, who is actually disabled in real life, and he brought her on to play this character who is also disabled. And I appreciated that he used someone who actually had these things in real life, and because of that, her performance was able to become a whole lot more believable. And this actress is just really good in this role. She absolutely shines here, and she is the highlight. Even though Sarah Paulson is the bigger name here, obviously, I feel like Kiera Allen is the one that shines the brightest. She really goes through the emotional ringer in this movie, and I think her performance is really powerful and really endearing to watch. Now, that isn't to say Sarah Paulson's performance isn't without merit, not at all. In fact, I feel like Sarah Paulson, I haven't really been enjoying her as an actress recently. I didn't really like her in the movie Glass, and I feel like in American Horror Story, she was starting to play the same type of character. But in this movie, she really does a good job at embracing this role that becomes more and more menacing as it goes on, and more frightening. Scare-wise, this movie is also pretty solid. I think that there are some really good tense moments here where I was actually sitting on the edge of my seat. There are some white-knuckled intense moments where you're just really hoping that Chloe will not get caught by her mother, or that she is going to get out of a very precarious, dangerous situation. And Anish Chaganty just does a great job of building up the tension in so many scenes. What really sold this movie for me was its twist. Now, some of you all may have seen this twist coming, but I certainly didn't, and it was a really good twist. You knew that something was up with the mother, but what they do come up with is actually pretty surprising. As far as critiques of this movie go, I suppose that there are a lot of plot holes that you can think about once the movie is finished. I will admit, after I started reading some reviews and some thoughts on the movie, I could see how some plot holes could come up. Like, for an example, how is the mother able to give her daughter her own medication without the approval of the doctors, or without drawing suspicion from medical professionals, and other things like that. However, I did really enjoy this movie and found it pretty compelling and pretty interesting, so I'm going to give it a strong 3.5 out of 5 stars with a general recommendation. It's a pretty good movie with 2 really good lead performances that I think just works really well as a thriller. So yeah, check it out.
On Sunday, the 9th of August in North Kensington, a demonstration took...
Next up is the movie Mangrove, directed by Steve McQueen, and it's part of a Small Acts series that he's making. And this is a series of 5 different movies surrounding around 5 different things, mainly regarding racial issues. And this movie feels very relevant to the times, even though it's taking place back in the 1970s. This movie surrounds the Mangrove 9 in 1970, who clashed with the London police, who were trying to basically get rid of this Mangrove store that was mainly for people of color, and obviously the police did it with very racial intent. The movie shows that, and because of this, the characters start protesting, and eventually all of them are arrested for inciting riot and violence. And these characters essentially have to testify in trial that they were innocent of these crimes, and that the police were the ones who ultimately were the ones inciting the violence. Now, some of you might notice that that plot arc sounds very similar to the trial of the Chicago 7, and in some ways it is sort of similar. It revolves around a trial and it revolves around characters protesting something. But I think Mangrove works a lot better because it is hyper-focused on one thing, and that is racial issues and how people of color were treated wrongly. And ultimately the message of the movie is that they are still treated wrongly even now. But they're also trying to bring across an inspiring message of hope through these characters trying to make things better, not just for themselves, but also for their children and for their children's children. And because of that, for as dark and as harrowing as this movie is, I feel like Steve McQueen actually ends the movie off on an optimistic note, which I did appreciate. And I appreciate the messages that go throughout the movie. They feel very powerful and very heartfelt. And they come from someone who has obviously dealt with racial tensions as a man of color himself, and that makes the message hit all the more harder and hit home more for me personally. Also, the performances here are just great all across the board. Sean Parks as Frank Critchlow gives an incredible performance. I loved watching him go through this change of someone who originally didn't want to really be involved in the political side of things, but eventually realizes that he has to, not only for himself, but for his family. But my favorite performance probably goes to Letitia Wright as Ophelia Jones. She is great in this movie, really just showing this broad emotion and broad passion that really feels so realistic and so human that you can't help but sort of relate to it and understand it, and you can't help but feel the passion along with her. The same goes for Malachi Kirby as Darkest Jones. One of his monologues near the end of the movie is just so wonderful, it actually sent chills up my spine. The performances in this movie are all around great. I don't feel like there's a single weak one in the bunch personally. Another big difference between this movie and the Trial of the Chicago 7 is I feel like Steve McQueen has a bit more of a confident hand in the directing department. I feel like he just makes shots a lot more interesting, and he keeps the trial feeling very energetic and very moving forward. And he lets the trial also slow down and show some tension when it needs to. And because he knows how to navigate the balance of that, the movie becomes a lot more compelling to watch, and the trial scenes become a lot more interesting. Overall, I don't have a lot of critiques of this movie. I suppose maybe the only one is that it ends a little abruptly, and it ends on a bit of a weird note, but that didn't bother me too much. So overall, I'm going to give this a strong 4 out of 5 stars. It's probably one of my favorite movies of the year so far, and it's definitely one I recommend you see, especially for its important and very timely subject matter.
I wasn't sleeping.
Do you want to, go hang out?
Yeah. Yeah.
I am not going to say the title of this movie for fear of getting age restricted, but this movie is written, directed by, and stars Cooper Raiff, who plays a homesick college freshman who is struggling to adapt to the college environment. Eventually, he meets this girl named Maggie, who he starts really falling for. And in this one night, they start forming a relationship together and begin talking about the ups and downs of life as they're going out to bury Maggie's turtle. Now, while this movie's premise might not sound like the most interesting thing here, it's ultimately what Cooper Raiff does with it that makes it work so incredibly well for me. First of all, I have to sort of admit that I probably relate to the character of Alex more than I would care to admit. I definitely also had this feeling of isolation in college. I felt like in my freshman year that I couldn't connect to anyone, and I felt like I was just sort of an outsider, and I felt like a bit of an imposter in this world, and he echoes a lot of those emotions in a very powerful and very relatable way, to the point where I think Cooper Raiff was probably writing as much about himself as he was about this character. And because this performance is so relatable to not only me, but I'm sure to a lot of other people who felt homesick in their freshman year of college, it just makes it work all the more. And if anything, I almost wish this movie had focused on that aspect a little more. But the focus of the movie on the relationship between Alex and Maggie isn't actually a bad idea at all, because their relationship is so good and feels so real that it's just like you know these characters in real life almost. They feel so human, so legitimately real, and that's because of the great performances given by Cooper Raiff and by Dylan Kalula as Maggie Hill. She matches his performance beat for beat in every moment, in my opinion. It's great to follow these two characters along and to just get to know them. These characters don't actually do much in the movie besides just talk to one another about different things. And the conversation just sort of flows naturally. It just keeps going and they keep talking about different stuff. But all of it feels so natural and so right to the movie that the movie just works in that regard. Now, as far as critiques go, once again, for this movie, I feel like I don't have that many. I suppose I will admit that the movie does become, in its ending parts, a little bit messy. I'm not really sure if it has an exact message it wants to say, and it tries to have multiple different messages. It feels like it's trying to say almost too much at once when I feel like it could have hyper-focused on maybe one thing, since it was focused more on the relationship between Alex and Maggie, more than the homesickness. But still, this was an excellent movie. This really surprised me. I hadn't heard anything about this movie until it started getting some critical acclaim, and this movie just really worked for me, and I really related to it, which is probably why it just worked for me on a personal level. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for me.
We have a real connection, a rare and intense attachment.
And finally, we have I'm Thinking of Ending Things, directed by Charlie Kaufman, the maker of the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which I absolutely love, and many other great movies. And this movie is about a nameless young woman who is looking to, as the title suggests, end things with her boyfriend named Jake. And they essentially go on this road trip together where she meets his parents, but then weird things start to happen. I'm going to keep this review short because I honestly feel like I couldn't do this movie justice no matter how hard I tried in my descriptions. This is a masterpiece of a film. Easily the best film I've seen this year, and I don't think there's going to be a film that'll beat it this year probably at this point. It would take a lot. This film is just so powerful in what it talks about. It philosophizes about so many different things, about death, about movies, about the nature of human existence. It is all so wonderfully talked about and so compelling to watch. The visuals in this movie are wonderful. The performances are masterful. Jesse Plemons might give his best performance yet, which is saying something because he is just a great actor all around. Jessie Buckley is wonderful in this, as are Toni Collette and David Thewlis. Pretty much everyone is great in this movie. And man, the ending of this movie is just, it is something to behold. And that's all I have to say. I don't want to spoil much about this movie, really. I don't want to say much more. This is a movie that you need to experience for yourself, because it has so much to say. And I feel like it was just such a welcome movie for a year as hard and tiring as this one. This movie was a welcome relief in what it was talking about, and I think it just really left an impact on me. A huge impact. Very, very strong 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. Check this one out for yourself. My words couldn't do it enough justice. So yeah, that was episode 11 of The Critical Corner. Sorry for being gone for so long, but there is going to be a lot more content along the way. Be on the lookout for lists coming out very soon for countdowns. It's nearing the end of 2020, believe it or not, so it's time to start counting down my favorite songs and my favorite movies of the year. Although song countdowns will probably be coming out first, and I'll have a couple individual reviews out over the next couple weeks. But in December, it's list season, so that'll be the focus. Alright, thank you all so much for watching, and until then, I will see you all in the next video.